Before introducing our first speakers, I'd like to read a letter that came to us. It reads, Dear Mr. Porteous, speakers and guests at the Eucharistic Convention in Auckland, New Zealand, 2015. I speak to you from halfway around the world. My voice may be silent to you, but my message can be heard loud and clear. My intention was to give each and every one of you a big hug. Unfortunate circumstances made this dream disappear in a split second. While on a very short lecture tour in Germany, I promised a dear friend to speak at her school, and I fell and broke my left arm. I am immensely grateful to Bob and Freda Narev for taking my place. Words are not enough for the utmost patience and consideration shown to me by John Porteous and my travel agent, Terry Fitzgerald. I thank you both from the bottom of my heart for all you have done for me. In this holy time of rebirth and freedom, the celebration of Easter and Passover, our hearts are filled with hope and renewal. In the scheme of things, we all belong to the same family, whether we are Catholic, Hindu, Muslim, or Jewish. There was a first world gathering of Jewish Holocaust survivors in Jerusalem in 1981. My wonderful friend, Rosalie Comentucci, who is a Catholic, she and I wrote the only new song presented at this celebration. And I read you the words of the song, words by Inge Auerbacher and music by Rosalie Comentucci. Out of ashes our spirits rise, tears rain down from the weeping skies. We have suffered and endured the fire, immense horrors and miles of barbed wire. History's greatest evil and hell, we all bear witness, we are here to tell. The world was deaf, where was the light? There seemed no end to the long, long night. We will always remember, we shall never forget. Trumpets of joy sound freedom's call. Love for God and man above all, we shall never forget. Minds were dulled by bombs of hate. Only the hero cared about our fate. We saw the truth, it began to unfold. You may kill the body, but never the soul. We will always remember, we shall never forget. Trumpets of joy sound freedom's call. Love for God and man above all, we shall never forget. Here we are with honor and pride, a new generation at our side. The silent voices join us today. Never, never again, we hope and pray. We will always remember, we shall never forget. Trumpets of joy sound freedom's call. Love for God and man above all, we shall never forget. With many blessings, Shalom, your friend, Inge Auerbacher. Meeting Bob and Freda Narev is probably one of the warmest things I've had the pleasure of doing. And that didn't happen a long time ago. You'll see that there are two chairs at my left because they have decided to treat us like their grandchildren. And what an honor that is, to be at the feet of your grandparents and listen to the wisdom that they are going to impart to us. How blessed we are. Bob was interned with his mother in Theresienstadt concentration camp during the war. They were liberated in 1945, and in 1947 took a converted troop ship on their way to New Zealand. But not enough just to save themselves and come to a new world. They brought with them 2 young children who were to be the adopted children of a family in Australia, and dropped them off on their way over. How we've looked after Australia ever since. When they got to New Zealand, they took pity on the local population. And Bob, I'm sorry if I pronounce your original surname totally incorrectly, but I'm going to give it a try. They changed their surname from Narawetchits to Narev. Thank you very much. Bob went to Auckland Grammar School and then on to Auckland University, where he got degrees in law and languages. Freda, as Freda Malaka, hailed from Wits in Poland. She survived the war by living like a Catholic for 3 years until her older sister came and took her away. She too came to New Zealand, went to Auckland Girls Grammar School. They met and were engaged in 1957 and married in 1959. It is outstanding to note that Freda has received the Queen's Service Medal and Bob the New Zealand Order of Merit, both of them for their service to the community. Freda did say to us that if she wasn't feeling well, she wouldn't be addressing us. I'm very pleased to say to you that not only she's well, she has a smile the size of Texas, and we look forward to your greeting and your address. Thank you very much. Didn't I tell you this smile was due? At the end of their talk, there will be question time, and there's a roving mic that will come to you. Could I ask you, please, to come towards the front so that the microphone doesn't have to run too far?
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to speak to you. In relation to the introduction, I'm quite sure that we're old enough to be grandparents to most of you here. We have spoken on a number of occasions to schools about our experiences, and we're happy, of course, also to speak to adult audiences. We normally divide our little talk into 3 sections. Freda will tell her story of survival as a child Holocaust victim. I will speak about my story, and we will then have time for questions. Before Freda does speak, I just want to give you a very brief historical background to the Holocaust, with which you may well already be familiar in any event. The First World War ended in 1918 with the defeat of Germany, and there were very serious social and economic conditions in Germany, and the time was ripe for a dictator to appear on the scene, and that was Adolf Hitler. He decided that the best way to resolve the problem was to find a scapegoat for what had happened to Germany during the war, and a very easy target, because they were very readily identifiable, were the Jewish population, not only in Germany, but ultimately also in the rest of conquered Europe. In 1933, he came to power with his Nazi party, and in 1935, in September of that year, and I'd ask you to bear that date in mind for what I'm going to tell you later, they held a conference at Nuremberg in Germany, in which they passed what are now known as the Nuremberg laws, which were the discriminatory laws against the Jewish people. They fell into 5 sections. The first was identification, the second was confiscation, the third one was concentration. That's not the concentration camp, but the need or the requirement for Jewish people to live in a small part of each town where they had previously had free range. The fourth stage was deportation to the death camps, and of course the fifth stage was what was euphemistically called the final solution, when 6 million Jewish people and a number of other people who were not acceptable to the racist theory of the Nazis were exterminated. So that is the background, and now Freda will tell her story. And you'll forgive her if there's occasional lapse in speech.
And memory. Hello, everyone. My family was lived in a little town close to Vilnius called Vidze, and we'd been there for several generations. In 1941, the Nazis conquered our little town, and the 15 leaders of the Jewish community were put to death and buried in a common grave. Now, I've wondered, how did they know, newcomers know who the 15 men of the leaders of the community were, but that's a question that's going to be unanswered.
Your father was one of them.
My father was one of those men. So my mother was placed with 2 daughters, 3. One had gone to stay with Wellington, relatives, and didn't return. She disappeared, as the relatives did. And my mother could see that as a 3 or 4-year-old, my chances were survival were very, very slim. And so she arranged with a Catholic Far family. I don't know how they knew each other. And she left me in their care.
Last time I saw her.
And that was the last time I saw her, because she too disappeared on the Holocaust. It was very brave of my mother to entrust her daughter into an unknown family, but I'm so pleased that she did. And they were very kind to me, and they raised me as Catholics. They were very religious themselves. So during the war, I was fairly safe with them. I had no idea what was going on, and except that I didn't see my mother again. And there were all sorts of incidents, like the German soldiers would come and search the house and and of course I was hidden in a trunk in case they wanted me, but they didn't. They wanted the partisans who lived in the woods in front and round. Sorry.
Don't apologise.
So 3 years later, a young person came, and I was told that she was my sister Lisa, and that she wanted me to go with her. Well, as you can imagine, I wasn't keen to go. I was very happy on the farm with that family, but apparently this lady Karlovitova had promised my mother that whoever had survived could came and claim me. And this is what happened. So this was about 1945, 1944, when the Russians liberated our town and our place. So somehow Lisa found another group of survivors of our town, just a small group, and somehow, without internet and telephone and everybody knew that there were displaced persons camps in Germany, and if we made our way there, we would be helped and we'd be saved. And this is, and that's what happened. Now, one thing that the disadvantage of being a child is that nobody tells you anything. You recognize that one. Well, so I grew up on the farm and I didn't know anything about what had happened to my family or the Jewish people until we got to a displaced person camp. First of all in Berlin, and then there were others in other places, deeper into Germany, because the Iron Curtain, the Iron Curtain, translation, had come down, and so we were transported, I suppose, deeper into Germany, until finally the last one was Landsberg, close to Munich, and we stayed there about 4 years or something. And it was really in the playground, and there was a school there for us, and there was every nationality in the world were in Europe were there in the playground. So they decided to make a same new language for all of us. They were all Jewish children, to make modern Hebrew the language at the school. And so from the time we walked into the school, that's all we heard. And we used our own languages in the playground. Now, it was in the playground that I heard what had happened to families, what had happened that might have happened to our family, and that there were many, many orphans and I was a lucky one because I had a sister who was 18 years older than I to look after me, and she became my mother in 1945. Now, what others do I have to tell you?
We came to New Zealand.
So we stayed in that displaced persons camp for about 4 years, waiting for permission to come to New Zealand. And this is what people were doing. They were waiting to be allowed to enter a country, because the camps were for displaced our one was for Jewish people. So the camps were run by the United Nations with lovely American personnel, very kind, sort of everything that any surviving child or adult would need, and provided that. So that was how I learned about the Holocaust, because nobody told us, nobody told me, and discovered when we shared rooms with other families, and the adults worked, told each other their experiences, and we heard, and that's how we learned.
Come to New Zealand.
So in 1949, our permission came for us to come to New Zealand, and I'd had a cousin and her husband here, and they sought permission because immigration was restricted. And when I came to New Zealand, and I started at Bayfield School in Home Day, and then Auckland Girls Grammar, everybody was so kind to me, and the teachers especially, very kind, and helped me with English, because I didn't know any English. When I came to New Zealand, I could speak modern Hebrew and write. I could speak and write Russian, because I'd been to a Russian school for 1 year. I could speak Polish and Yiddish, but no English, no, not even the alphabet. That was but it was amazing how easy it was to learn things when you're in a happy environment.
To finish soon.
So I was really lucky to have kind people risk their lives for me and to look after me. And so I survived, and I'm grateful for that. But what have I lost? I'm really a woman who has lost her identity, because all the records of our town had been lost in the fire. So I didn't even have a good record of my birth date. And I had to, so Lisa had to have 2 witnesses come and register me after the war, and that's how I got my identity. And sometimes I wonder, am I who I am?
She is.
It does cross my mind, but I guess I've built an identity for myself, and I've built a family history. We're building a family history with Bob and 3 children and grandchildren now. So we're starting again, and I think that's the secret of surviving, and that is to carry on. Don't grieve too long about the past, but carry on and build a future.
Right. So we now come to part 2, the story of Bob's experiences. You'll recall that I mentioned the Nuremberg conference in September 1935. 3 weeks later, in October 1935, I was born in a small German town north of Frankfurt, where my family, like Freda's in Poland, had lived for generations. But, of course, things turned pear-shaped, if that's not too mild an expression, in about 1936 for us, when my father, who was a secondary school teacher at the local public school, lost his job because the Nazis no longer considered it appropriate for a Jewish man to be teaching non-Jewish children. There was no more work for him in Eschwege, the town where I was born, so the family shifted to Frankfurt, where there was still one Jewish school allowed to operate, and he was able to teach there for about 3 or 4 years until in early 1941 the Germans closed all Jewish schools, and there was no longer any education allowed for Jewish children or teaching by Jewish teachers. We had reached the concentration stage where we were required to live in a particular part of town. We were not allowed to mix with the general population, and all Jewish people were required to wear the yellow Jewish star whenever they went out of their home. I've got it somewhere in my pocket, and I'll show you shortly. Because we had to be identified in the street as being Jewish, because that allowed the general population to treat us really like fourth-class citizens. We had to get off the footpath if somebody was passing, and generally we were no longer citizens of the country in which the family had lived for many years. So this was the star. I don't know whether you can see it at the back. The shape is the Star of David. The color is yellow, which is the color of cowardice. And in the middle is the German word for Jew. And whenever you were out in the street, you had to have it sewn onto your lapel. If not, dire consequences would follow. This carried on till August 1942, when my parents got notice from the authorities to report to the local railway station. I had no idea. I was 6 years old, no idea what was happening, but I'm quite sure they knew that things were going to get worse. So we turned up at the railway station. My little family at that stage consisted of my father, my mother, and 2 elderly grandmothers, and I. And the one thing that I do remember from that occasion is that a Nazi officer came up to my father and asked him whether he had any money on him. Now, we were not allowed to take any valuables, no money, no jewelry, nothing much other than the clothes that we stood up in. And my dad, who was a very honest person, said, "No, I've got nothing on me." His pockets were searched, and the officer found the equivalent of a 50-cent piece in his pocket. And this officer hit my father across the face several times until his nose bled, and that's one of the very vivid memories I still have of that time. We and about 1,000 other Jewish people from Frankfurt had to board a train, And after a journey which was not very comfortable in third-class carriages, fortunately there weren't at that stage cattle wagons, as was the case with later transports, we finished up in a railway siding in Czechoslovakia, near the capital of the Czech country of Czechoslovakia, then now the Czech Republic. We had to get off the train. It was August, and that, as you all know, is the reverse of the winter season in New Zealand. It was summer, it was very hot, and apart from the stresses of the occasion, we had to walk in the hot sun for 3 kilometers to get to the concentration camp of Theresienstadt that was mentioned to you before. When we got there, the men were separated from the women and children. The town had been a staging post for the Czech army before Czechoslovakia surrendered, and it was designated for about 5,000 or 6,000 Czech soldiers who had by then been thrown out of town. And during the time that I was in the camp, there were never fewer than 40,000 Jewish people in the camp. So you can imagine how crowded the conditions were. My father was put in one set of barracks and my mother and I in a dormitory in another. And I stayed with her for about 3 or 4 weeks. And then the children were again separated from the adults and put into what was called a children's home. It was not very restrictive. We were allowed to go out, meet our parents, play in the street, although of course there was not much to play with. And we were a little fortunate in that the house that I was in with the other children, there was also an 18-year-old Czech trainee teacher, a Jewish girl, who did her best to teach us as much as was possible without pens, without papers or books. We all had to learn the Czech language because that became the common one for the children. I was completely fluent in Czech as a result, and when we went back to Czechoslovakia, which I'll talk about later, to see where we had been, I couldn't remember a single word. So you can imagine how the mind selectively turns off unpleasant experiences. And this is why a lot of the memories that Freda and I should have had of our Holocaust experiences are not that clear. They're sometimes second-hand, but some outstanding matters still stick in the memory. Unfortunately, my father became ill. He had to have an operation. There were no real medical facilities, and he didn't survive. Now, the camp was basically a transit camp where people were being gathered from all conquered European countries to be transported to the death camps, Auschwitz and Treblinka and the others that you may have heard of. But for reasons which I will never know, we got stuck there for 2.5 years, possibly because my mother, who was in reasonable shape, was able to